I have often seen people criticize Bali that are here that are saying it's too relaxed to like build a business, but that's very much a problem with the individual versus a problem with the place. I think it's less to do with the area. I think where you should be set up is somewhere that you really enjoy.
Darren Lee is a digital nomad and podcaster,
and the founder of FOEX, where he builds entrepreneurs' influence and authority through podcasting.
So you can get to 10K a month and all this in a short period of time with a high amount of focus. However, like the reality is that it's going to take you twice as long as you think. It's going to be twice as hard as you think, and it's going to be a lot more painful. I guess if we're looking for fucking goals and like here's the goal I want to achieve, or like here's what I want to understand, or like here's where I want to piece together, right? Because what's just interesting to observe is just the fact that like when you lock in towards that goal, you're not going to sacrifice long-term goals for short-term happiness. And if I was to ever share one bit of like wisdom, it's just that. And most guys are not sharing their experiences. They're not sharing what's happening in their life, the highs, lows, the challenges, the obstacles, because that's what people pull to, right? People buy the story, not the product. So over time, if we're able to basically share a lot of that insight, you become that authority figure. Your business is a reflection of you often. And like if I was more stressed, like it just felt like things are more stressed in the business. And even now, you don't need to hit rock bottom to solve the problem. There's nowhere else to hide but yourself, effectively. Like at some point you can't hide from yourself. That was one of the biggest things for me that was like, all right, I need to sort this out.
I mean, we were just talking just then before we kicked off, that lifestyle of living in Bali, I think it probably gets romanticized a little bit as well. I guess, especially in that digi-nomad sort of world that, people go, I live in Bali and I live on my laptop and I sit by the villa and stuff. So, and you've just described there, but you're punching out 100-hour weeks. Where's that disconnect for people you think that they're getting wrong about the lifestyle living in Bali on your laptop?
I think it's kind of everywhere though, right? Like I have often seen people criticize Bali that are here that are saying it's too relaxed to like build a business, or there's too much nice things to build a business around here. But that's very much a problem with the individual versus a problem with the place, right? Like there's many entrepreneurs in Adelaide that are crushing it. There's many entrepreneurs that are in Manchester and, Scottsdale that are crushing it. I think it's less to do with the area. I think where you should be set up is somewhere that you really enjoy, right? So like I've been in Asia for many years. I love like Asian culture, Asian food. I love the weather. I come from Ireland, right, where it like rains 99.9% of the time. So I've just tried to escape that lifestyle basically, and I was able to kind of get out of that lifestyle. But what you have to kind of realize is that like the environment doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be like successful or whatever successful is, right? Which is kind of my tribe with people saying that you need to be in Dubai or you need to be in Miami. There's a ton of pros to doing it. But do you need to be there to be successful? I don't necessarily think so. I think you can still do it without being there. Now, does that mean I wouldn't live there in the future? Definitely not. But I think for a lot of guys, they get very hung up on those factors being like, is it my city or whatever? But at the end of the day, the work has to be done and someone has to do the work. So it kind of doesn't matter where you were. But from a lifestyle factor perspective, I do think Bali is like super elite for that, right? Because it's weather's great, food is great, standard of living is so good. Especially as you're starting, like I think like 0 to 30K a month, like Bali or Thailand is really, really good. And then as you want to scale up, then you might want to look at some other places, but it depends on your lifestyle factors too, man, where you are in your journey. I know many guys here. I'm going to a mastermind here in August, and the dude is working 2 days a week because he has a bunch of other commitments with his family and everything. And he's doing like $250,000 a month. So like guys can do it, right? You don't necessarily need to be chained to a desk or whatnot. Just depends on where you are in your skill set. Like this guy's in his 40s, so he's obviously much further on than we are. But I just think it's interesting, right? I try to remove the emotion from the vehicle or the location and much more focus on the inputs and what I can do basically to improve my scenario.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was only talking with a mate in the gym the other day and we kind of like had this very similar mindset. So if, I don't know how familiar you are with Australia, but like, Adelaide is kind of seen of like, oh, it's the small town. Like even though it's a city, but it's kind of like everyone knows everyone sort of vibe, 20 minutes to get to the city wherever you are. And so whenever you bring up the idea that I'm pursuing X, Y, and Z, they go, oh, you probably need to move to Melbourne or Sydney for that. And it was really interesting, like just this paradigm shift. I only recently got back from a podcast trip from Sydney and I was there and I'm like, there's so much wasted time commuting. There's so many, so much mundane sort of feeling around the place. There's no inspiration. There's no creativity in a big CBD. And like Hormozy says, it's like you're playing, especially in business, it's who can stay in business the longest. Like you talk about as well, the infinite game sort of mindset. And I'm like, so to me personally, if being in Adelaide, where is maybe quote unquote not the most ideal place to get a business up and running or whatever, hire people and all those sort of things. But if that allows me to play the long game and stay in business for the next 50 years, then who's actually winning using that strategy as well? Much, I guess, your point there
100%.
as well. Like, there's so many other factors than just being like, oh, but this is the place.
100%, man. And I think that's the problem with guys when they're jumping into these things, is the fact that they look at it in isolation. It's like, if I just run this ad, all my problems going to be solved. If this just figures out, if I figure this out, where it's not, that's not the reality, right? A lot of business comes in seasons. There's different elements to your own growth. Even like the entrepreneur that I am today is much different than last year, like completely different. The business is completely different. Uh, in many ways, we've added much more, we've subtracted more. Even this morning, I had to look at something completely objectively and just got it. I was working on something for about 2 months, and I can
Mm,
explain this. I don't mind. So a bit of context for people. My business is, we're growing and launching podcasts. So we have a done for you offer where we build and grow podcasts, and now we have a new coaching offer, which is where we do it with people. So we help people learn the skills to grow and
yeah.
launch their podcast. However, we had a way that we were acquiring customers, which I don't care talking about it. Which was, we were going to find startups that had raised capital and pitch them a
Hmm.
podcast. Right, it seemed a good idea, and it was a good idea. And all of our leadership team, we all approved, thumbs up. I spent 60 fucking days sending outreach messages to people, and then at the end of it, 11 o'clock last night, I had a call with someone, and he's like, "I just don't get it." And then at that point, you have to cut your losses. I woke up this morning and was like, "I need to cut this." And I just
Yeah.
think it's interesting because, like, this is the stuff that actually happens in a business. This is the reality of what happens actually in life. It's not the fucking, the city or the network or whatever, which is super important. It's super, super important. But I just think that there's the other element of, like, when you get into the nuance of something, like I heard Chris Williamson say, like, the N word of 2024 is nuance, because
Mm,
that's the reality.
yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
reality of, like, what actually happens behind the surface. Now, at the same time, we're still building, like, my podcast is basically my own network, I guess, and the people that I've met have been through my own network, and there, it is very invaluable. But the same question you're asking me, I was asked last week at a sales conference. I was speaking at a sales event, and someone was like, "Oh, like, do I need to have, like, to be in one of these big cities?" I was like, "No, like, you don't have to." Like, I moved out of Singapore, dude. I used to live in Singapore,
Yeah.
and I moved out of Singapore because I was like, everyone here is like 40 and has like 4 kids. I don't want to have children.
Yeah.
So I was like, why am I here? I spent
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
year there. So I think I have a nice perspective on it, kind of a balanced perspective, versus like, oh, you need to be here and then you need to talk to girls in this way. And you need to do this and this. I'm just like, no, dude, you need to just play the game, go really hard at it. You're going to get smashed in the face, and just get up and
Mm.
go again and again and again and again and again. Like, that's my perspective on things. And I've been doing this for nearly half a decade at this point now, right?
Yeah, it's like 100%. Like, if you think that that location is going to have the opportunities, I always, like, people get pissed off with me saying this. I'm like, you don't find opportunities, you create them. And whether there's
Mm.
however much reality there is to that statement, it's the same with the luck concept. Like, you create your own luck. Sure, there's outside factors and things that come into play there still. But at the end of the day, you put yourself in those positions to get lucky, to get the opportunities,
100%.
to have the conversations with someone like yourself right now. Like, and that leads in, the path of someone wanting to start a podcast, and you're like, I don't know where to start. I don't know what guests to get on. It's like, just fucking message people. That's what I did.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's what you did when you first started as well. You're like, oh my God, most people said no. They're like, dude, you get like 5 views. I'm not going to come onto your podcast. But like,
Yeah.
then you get one that just says yes. And you're like, why the hell did you say yes? I'm not complaining. Let's just do it. Like, you just run through
Mm.
it.
It's the same with anything, right? Same with your PT, right? In the beginning, when you were getting started, you're probably shitting your pants, being like, how am I going to coach someone? I can barely coach myself, you know? And it's almost like, you need to realize that sometimes you don't need to be a 10 out of 10 to coach someone who's a 0 out of 10. You can be a
Mm,
2 out of 10 to coach someone out of 0 out of 10. You can be a 4 out of 10 to coach someone out of a 1 out of 10. And the best way it was described to me was by William Brown, who said, if you're going to learn golf, you don't learn from Tiger Wolf. Tiger Woods. You learn from someone who's in your local golf club who's like a 3 or 4
yeah.
out of 10. Because Tiger Woods is coaching people who are a 9.9 out of 10, and he's the 10 trying to get them up to the 9.95. And it's
Yeah.
like, you almost don't want that master. You want someone who's slightly, like, basically within your remit. And I think that allows for, again, we go back to the infinite game, right? Like, there's a pattern here, right? I come from tech, the deep tech background, where you raise a ton of capital, you build these platforms, you try to get profitable, and you go bust. I've just seen behind the curtain a lot of this, because a lot of my earlier years from 18 to 23 was in these tech platforms, tech startups. And I've just seen the pattern, right? Which is like
Mm.
high aggressive growth, really, really all in, like, stab everyone in the back. And then they're out of business in like 2 years. And I've
Yeah.
just seen this over and over again. I've worked at these companies over and over again. And I'm just like, this is not something that these guys can play forever. Whereas if you look at, I know you mentioned like Rogan or whatever, right? Some of the bigger guys, does he take himself that seriously so that he can do 2,500 episodes? No.
Mm.
He's just been rolling with it through the process. And yes, he's self-critical. Yes, he's trying to improve. There's all those little subtle nuances that are improving. But I don't know. Like as I've gotten a little bit older, like I'm 28 now, business is a good position. We're growing. We have a good position to be in. Less from a scarcity perspective, I would say. Nothing is super, super immediate. You take the steps 100%. You make sure you're walking it down every single day. But most people are not doing that. Most people are not
Yeah.
doing the basics, man. And you probably know that yourself from fitness, right?
Mm.
Most people are not putting down that fucking brownie on a Friday night. They're eating it.
Yeah, exactly. It starts with that one step forward and then you just building on that. And I think really good point there with the Tiger Woods example you gave. I was chatting with a guy in the gym today, like about the comparison of your body and things like this to the other guys in the gym or how much people lift and things like that. And so if you're comparing yourself to that person that has the better physique or they can lift, let's call it, they can just deadlift 20 kilos more than you. And you're like, oh, I'm not good enough because there's someone better than me. Well, then you're actually also saying the person that lifts 20 kilos less than me is not good enough. But you don't have that conversation with the person that's below, quote unquote, below you with how much they lift. But we seem to have that conversation with ourselves about the people above us. And it's like, so if we I think if we frame that same mindset, then, oh, I don't have what it takes to do X. And it's like, well, you do. You just maybe need to change the people that you're having those conversations and you're training and you're coaching and you're helping. And as those skills develop, then so does the caliber of the people you're working with.
100%. And this is why I love fitness, right? So, I have a bodybuilding background. This is why all of my lessons come from fitness. And I'm really, that's why I love this conversation, right? Because you wouldn't throw 100 kilos on the bar if you've never benched 100 kilos. If you're going from 60 to 100, you wouldn't do it. You also wouldn't go out and run a marathon. Like you would look at that objectively being like, that's stupid. Whereas in the business case or the comparison around health or anything like this, people don't look at those galactic jumps and think, oh, like that's normal. I should be able to do that straight away. And that's
Yeah.
why, to some degree, like hate comes from below, right? Whereas the guys that are benching 110 kilos, 120 kilos, they're not looking down at you like in disgust. They're almost giving you more encouragement, to be honest, than the people below you, right? So it just kind of completes a circle in terms of like the reality of like, yes, 100% you can like build that business, you can get to 10K a month and all this, and you can do relatively in a short period of time with a high amount of focus. However, like the reality is that it's going to take you twice as long as you think, and it's going to be twice as hard as you think, and it's going to be a lot more painful, right? Like I'm 28. I think I've added like 10 years to my life in terms of how I look in the past like 3 years. Like I'm actually waiting to put up a meme that's going to be like me in 2020, like short hair, and then me in like no 2022, dude, short hair, and then 2024, like literally look like I'm like fucking 40 because like it's tough, right? It is tough. And
Yeah.
this is the reality of doing anything substantial. It's like even with dieting, I'm actually dieting right now to go to the US in September. So it is July right now. September is roughly around 6 weeks away. That 6 week period is going to get harder and harder and harder and harder. And then I'll get to a point and I'll hopefully be happy with my physique. And then I'll be starting our next podcast tomorrow in September. And I just think it's interesting because the lessons from bodybuilding and training have cemented me as an entrepreneur, I think, more so than anything else, because I can look at a diet that I'm doing over the next 6 weeks and think, I will physically not be shredded by tomorrow. It's not possible. But in 6 weeks of super dialed in training and not even getting fucking sauce on my food, would you believe? Like 6 weeks of that shit, then I'm going to be shredded at the end of it, right? And
Yeah.
I extrapolate that into business being like, it's very interesting. Let me give you an example to make this very tactical. So we're launching a coaching program right now. It just launched last night, and we've like a bunch of members in there, and we have a bunch of coaches in there, and we have lots of people like running operations and systems. And I said to the guys, I was like, it only gets better from here because we get better at the process. This next time we do it, the next time we do it, the next time we do it, it just infinitely improves. And this is where you get asymmetrical returns, right? Is that in the beginning, all the guys in my team are like, where's this? Where's this file? Where's that file? And I'm like, calm the fuck down. In the next like month, everything's going to be fine. And then in September, October, November, December, January, all through 2025, it's going to run like clockwork. We're gonna not have 20 people in our program. We're gonna have 100 people in our program. We're not gonna have 100. We're gonna have 1,000. And
Mm,
I just think that like most guys aren't willing to take those lessons from fitness into business because I think it's much more emotional, right? It's
yeah.
all emotion. It's all
Mm,
no logic, all emotion. I think that's we can kind of go down that avenue too. I think that's been a big lever for me is like letting go of that emotion and just kind of
mm.
saying like, okay, it's all beyond my control. The only thing I can operate from is logic for the most part without things kind of blowing up my face.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good example as well. But it kind of comes then into what you're familiar with as well. You accept that it will take time, but when you're unfamiliar with something, you expect it to be done a lot quicker than it will be done. And I like what you're
Mm,
saying now is like me when I first started developing my app and what we've been working
mm,
on within Check. And like I was like, oh yeah, this should be up and running in like a few months. Here we are, 12 months later, and we're like, fucking, I'm same as you. I'm like, dude, I swear I'm not 24. Like I swear I'm 30 by
mm,
now. Like it's crazy. But you just, anything you do, like if you went into the gym, you don't expect to be Arnold Schwarzenegger in one day, like you said. But
mhm,
if you went, maybe I could get pretty close in 15 years, well, then your expectations are so different and you're not going to be disappointed because when expectations are not met, that's where the
mhm.
disappointment comes from.
And how you approach a problem. That's another way to
Mm,
look at it too, right? So like let's say my coaches wants to go to like the World Series for bodybuilding, whatever that's called. And I remember when he made the change around 2022, he was 22 when he made the change initially. He left like a career in accounting. And he was like, all right, I'm going to go balls deep in this. I know a lot of these pro bodybuilders don't peak till their mid 30s, which is, 13 years of
mm,
gear, everything that comes with it, so on and so forth, all the competitions, the preps, the cutting, the shredding, everything. And then he played much more of an infinite game as a result. And I remember him at like 22 doing it. He was like 88 kilos. Now he's up at like 105, 110 kilos, probably competing at like 100. And what's just interesting to observe is just the fact that like when you lock in towards that goal, you're not going to sacrifice long-term goals for short-term happiness. And if I was to ever share one bit of like wisdom, it's just that, right?
mm,
That was how I turned like a lot of my life around because like I was trying to be a pro athlete, blew my knee open in a million pieces, and I had to go into education. I had to figure that system out, get through that process, and then by getting through that process, I realized I didn't want to do that process anymore. And then I looked at okay, building something, and it was all about not sacrificing long term goals for short term happiness. And the short term happiness, is partying, the vices, all that kind of stuff, which I did, right? And I did for many, many years and so on and so forth, which slowed down my progress and my growth, which we can get into too. But it's an interesting observation, right? And I think that really what focus is an elimination. It's like the
mm.
elimination diet, right? It's like you just
Yeah.
constantly eliminate stuff that's beyond the focus. And at this point right now, there's very little things beyond fitness that I do that's outside of the business of my podcast. Because
Yeah.
that's the focus. That's the main
Yeah.
focus.
Which is a learning. You have to go through those things and figure out what those
100%.
things, what needs to go and what can stay and what is your larger priority and things like that as well. So how did you balance that transition then? Like, so you said you went through that partying period and
Hmm.
that lifestyle, young Irish bloke, very common, I imagine. And
Bro,
was it when you then moved overseas that it really changed for you and put things into perspective?
I think so. It was a combination of factors. So like Irish and Australians, right? Very
Mm,
similar. Very similar in
yeah.
like genes and just the way we can approach things. Even the culture within the countries is quite similar. It's less, I would say, like ambitious compared to American culture in terms of that like rootless drive. Like I can walk down New York, dude, and tell someone my goals, and they're like, "Oh yeah, speak to that person, speak to this person, speak to that
Yeah.
person."
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like Irish culture, in particular, maybe Australia too, is much more like slow down, be happy with what you have, be grateful, and whatever, right? Which just basically isn't my genetics. Like it's just not in my genetics to be like that. So throughout my kind of 20s, I was still partying a lot, but I was pushing quite hard. Like I was trying to build an app at the time. I was trying to build like a few different stuff. I was building a bunch of stores. I ran parties. I did a lot of different things that were like fragmented. They were kind of like fragmented, but there was no consistency through it. So
Yeah.
then it was only during the pandemic when most people like basically lose their mind. That's when I started moving to Bali. I was in Asia, and the party scene just slowed down quite a lot. So I think I haven't really talked about this much, but one of the main reasons for me to stop partying was the fact that there was just less parties. And then when I would go to parties, they would just be shit, right? Because they'd be
Yeah.
haphazard together with like, someone in the corner playing decks and someone over there just half fucked. Like it wasn't cohesive. Whereas prior to the pandemic, we were going to some of the biggest parties like across Europe, right? Like all across Ibiza, all across the festivals in Europe, even across London. We'd go to the best clubs for the best DJs. So it was obviously a lot of fun. And then when that kind of got zapped out, the enjoyment from being on a session kind of started to decrease. And then when my podcast was kind of building, I was having these conversations like we're having today. And it's not about where you are, it's about where you're going. Okay. So a lot of times I'd have these conversations with young entrepreneurs, similar to the two of us, and they were so far ahead, and I couldn't figure out why was it that they were just so far ahead. And the reason being is because they weren't filling their mind with all this like bullshit, basically, which is like just partying, devices, soothing, effectively.
Yeah.
So it was only until I moved to Singapore I said, you know what? Alcohol's super expensive in Singapore. Let's just chill. Let's just take it out for now. Let's just do like a month. And within the first month, my energy started to like spike. My sleep improved. Like, dude, I even saw recently my sleep is double what it used to be. I used to sleep for
Wow.
4 hours a night. Now I'm sleeping for like 9 hours a night. It's crazy, right?
Mm.
Then the podcast started to grow more. We had the direct effect, which was the health, the indirect effect, second cause of effect, which is the business and the podcast, and mainly the podcast initially. And then I was thinking, okay, we're moving in the right direction. Things are growing. I need to get the fuck out of my kind of tech role at this point. And then I was thinking, okay, what's the next step? Which is building Voix. And how we kind of went about doing this was instead of the weekends whereby I would be out partying, I would just spend that time building out
Yeah.
the business. Pretty simple, right? And it allowed me to build from such a better position because one, I wasn't rushing and trying to get things done over time. It was a year long period. It was a very difficult period, but slowly building up that habit, and it just takes off, dude. And I think
Mm.
like the way habits like that work is that they work both positively and negatively. So a quitting alcohol habit allows you to exponentially like reach your goals, right? And improve your health, improve your fitness, improve your relationships. I had a ton of issues in my relationship and everything. And then the flip side is when you're deep down the negative habits, alcohol, porn, whatever, it spirals. It's like it's not a problem
Mm.
until everything is a problem. And I kind of like figured that out really in the middle of my 20s, like 24, 25. And what's interesting here is that I made those changes, a lot of it in silence. And then I kind of, when I came out, then in terms of people were like, oh, like, how are you doing this? Like, how is this built? How is this built? When I started to let people know, they were like, oh, like, that's cool. But at the same time, I know that if I told people in the beginning, there'd be a lot of backlash.
Yeah.
So that's why I did a lot of it kind of in silence. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the majority of the young guys that I mentor now, which by the way is completely free, I don't do anything paid. I do a bunch of calls with people every month around alcohol. A lot of them are in silence, so they're taking a step back from alcohol and just destructive habits, drink,
Yeah.
drugs, partying, and a lot of it is done in silence initially because they're so afraid. They're so afraid what the guys at the pub will say, what their co-workers of all people, what they will say. But I understand. I understand why. And yeah, man, it's a tough position to be in, especially as a young guy. There's so much expectation on you.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I was lucky that I kind of skipped out on that drinking, partying scene quite at quite a young age. Like I probably was 18 or maybe 19 in my when I was 19, and I was like, no, I don't really want to do that. Like I'm lucky that my family is so health orientated that both my
Right.
parents don't drink ever. Literally don't touch it. So like growing up with that, it was like, well, that's what I'm gonna do. And so it's really interesting. Like I don't quite have that understanding of having to break away because that was something I did so early that like I've not had to incorporate that. So it's interesting to hear you saying that it is quite a challenging thing. Because I guess, I guess maybe I have the blinkers on sometimes when some of my friends or people in my circle are like, going through that. And I'm like, oh, it's not that hard. Like, I've done it I've been doing it for 5 years and, like it's not that
Mm.
hard, but like obviously harder than it seems to me.
It's an addiction, right? Just like anything,
Yeah.
dude. It's just like sugar, right? Like,
Mm.
if I'm walking through the fucking store at 9 o'clock at night and I see those brownies, I'm like, those brownies look good. But it's a signal to my brain that's like,
Yeah.
I want the carbs, right? Like my coach always says to me, like, when you're eating carbs, like your body's signaling you want more carbs, like you want to keep on going. And like
Mm.
everything can become an addiction. Um, so to that point, someone like us who have like an addictive personality in the positive way, let's say an obsessive personality with health, fitness, just improvement in general, we can go the opposite direction. And one of my biggest mentors, Ned, who's the officiator at my wedding pretty soon as well, is he always says to me like I'm meant to be a young, dumb, like Irish drunk dumbass. Like he
Mhm.
always says to me, because he's like, I could see very quickly like how things could have turned if you didn't
Yeah.
make those changes. And you end up reliving the same 3 months, bro. Same 6 months, same 12 months. So like something has to change for you to change. And that's why I think a lot of times it's either a tumultuous event. Let's say like for me, when I recognized that I wasn't moving as fast as what I wanted to do in my 20s, not that major, but you know what I mean? Or something like they have to pay for. It's quite interesting. Is that you probably noticed this for this from coaching too? Is that like you could give someone coaching advice to improve their
Mm.
nutrition and their training, but until they take out their credit card, dude, they're not going to pay. They're not going to make the change. So there has to be like a driving force always
Yeah.
to make those kind of seismic changes. Is what I've kind of observed.
Yeah, which is interesting because I get that's still so it's an internal change to get to that stage, but sometimes you can be pushed by a bit of an external as well, which is it's just learning how to use those things, and
Mhm.
then because like sure, if you need to use an
Oops.
external motivator as per se at first to get you started, but it's now how can we turn that into an internal discipline, I guess, long term.
For sure, for sure. And like you'll know this as well from coaching, right? Which is like you give people what they want so that you can give them what they need. So let's say if someone comes to you and they're like, I want to lose 50 pounds so that my wife like finds me more attractive. Well, like, yes, you lose their weight, but then they obviously are struggling with like a confidence issue. It's like, why are they overweight 50 pound? There's something going
Mm,
on there. They're actually stressed. They have a bad relationship with their managers, with their food. They actually might have, let's say, an eating disorder or something. So there's like sometimes you need to look at the symptomatic issues and then fix the underlying issue, which I think for me is most prevalent when I'm looking at like especially young guys because like it's very easy for me to say to people just launch the offer, build an offer, like
yeah,
release content and so on. And for most guys, like if they're at that stage where they're off ground zero, like they're not just complete like degens basically, they're going to do it. But sometimes to fix the initial phase, it has to be an external factor driven by an internal set of change. And
yeah,
dude, like the fact that we're even talking about this, like it puts a lot of people, and if you're listening to this, like you're already so further ahead because like a lot of guys will get to their 30s, 40s, and 50s, sit through the humdrum of their corporate job, never make a change, and then have that midlife crisis at 40, 50,
yeah.
because they've never been really in control of their life. And that's what it goes down to, right? Like, do you really have a control of where you want to go, what you want to do? And like, this is for me putting on my hands. Look, I'm nearly talking back to myself, saying that like, I didn't have control for a
Yeah.
lot of this. And I still don't all the time. I still work too much and train too hard and don't recover as well and so on and so forth. So there's always areas of improvement, but I think I just spoke to Robert Glover this morning. If you're familiar with him,
Yeah.
he's an amazing, amazing guest. I spoke to him about 4 hours ago.
Mm,
He looked at like this self improvement space as much more of a puzzle, which is like instead of looking to try to find the answer, you're just looking to throw away the lid of the box. You don't know how the puzzle comes
mm,
together, and you're slowly piecing it together over the duration of your life. And that feeds into the infinite game, right? Because it's like we don't need all the answers today. We can work towards like a better future, basically. And I don't know, it just helped me live much more of a calmer life, I guess, than being super anxious to get things done pretty much automatically.
yeah, well, I like I think Andy Frisella. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, the
Mhm.
founder of First Form Supplement, real tough, like hard nut guy, and he uses the term aggressive patience, and that really like resonated and clicks. I think it's like
Mm.
they're two words that you kind of go, they don't seem like they should be together, but they fucking work really well together. In the concept that like
Mhm.
I'm going to push as physically hard and as mentally hard as possible, but I'm going to have the acceptance and the patience and understanding that it may take longer than I have in my head right now.
100%. I'm just taking out his name as well because I want to go check that out. And
No, that's
that's the
fine.
reality, right? It's like, you plan in decades, you execute in seconds, right? So
Mm,
I know we're kind of talking like kind of philosophical, like theoretical as well, but at the same time, I think when you have those goals set up or like the objectives where you want to go to, then it becomes the hammering stage. It's like, okay,
yeah.
we just hammer it because we know that it's correct, right? And I
Mm,
actually, this is very much more in line to everything you do, right? I'll give you a good example that you'll be able to recognize straight away. Like if you're in the gym and if someone's coming to you and they're saying they're training 6, 7 days a week and they're not making progress, it's obviously something to do with the way that they're training, right? Or it could
Yeah.
be their nutrition. So instead of getting them to train 10 times a week of what they're doing, you probably would go back and look at the source. You look at the source of information, you make the adjustments, you make the pivots. You might even bring them to 4 days a week. And then
Mm.
they're going to get way more progress, right? And it's almost like sometimes doing more is not necessarily the answer, it's doing it better.
Yeah.
And this is a big thing that I focus on with my content, with everyone that I work with. It's like, dude, we've taken people off of creating 8 episodes a month. They were creating 8 podcasts a month, and we chopped it in half, and they grew
Mm.
3 times faster. Because sometimes if you get the foundations wrong, then the rest of it is a complete mess. It goes for business, your content, your health, your fitness, your lifestyle, your relationships.
Mm.
I don't think more people are putting focus on that 0 to 1 emphasis without procrastinating and so on and so forth. But I mean, like, really, that's where you should really kind of dial into, right?
Yeah. But I think that's like if you're just mashing out 8 for the sake of it and there's not quality then as well, there is still that context. Like it's, and the same in the gym. If you're smashing out 8 sessions but they're 8 shit sessions, well, what
Mm.
sort of progress are you going to make? Like it's, you can't the concept even within creativity is something, it probably really aligns with a lot of people that will be listening to this, is like you can't force creativity. Like you have to almost just let that happen. You can't sit here and be like, be creative, think of the next big business idea, whatever it is. Sure, you can sit there and grind out solving a problem, but
Mm.
creativity is a very different thing. So at the same time as you can't force creativity, it just kind of the shower thoughts or the walk down the beach or you're about to go to bed and bang, the idea comes to your head. The same thing is you
Mm.
can't always like grind your way to bigger muscles by just doing more. Or if you're not sleeping and therefore you're not concentrating at work, you can't get the results you're after. Like there is a line. And I think that's where like the social media, kind of hustle and grind, as much as I love it, like I'm all for it,
Mhm.
but there is still a line somewhere out there.
There's a nuance,
Yeah,
right?
that
Like
bloody N
everything. It's
word again.
like
It's back.
it's just like it depends where you are in your journey, right? I think like if
Yeah,
you're young, dumb, it's like when we first started going to the gym. You said you're 24 right now.
yeah.
Yeah. So like I started training when I was 14. And
Mhm,
back then, like I would just go into my friend's gym, which was in his house. It was just a few dumbbells and whatnot. We'd go in there as many days as possible, just do chest over and over again. And then when I was playing rugby at a high level, we'd go to the gym and just do chest as much as possible, some deadlifts and
mm,
some squat. And then after like several years of doing that, I was still making progress, because that's the irony, is that you make a lot of progress in that period. And then you look at it and think, well, is there a better way that I could have trained? Could I be training my back, maybe my legs, and so on and so forth? So you do have to iterate. But I think as you build up the reps, and you have to put the reps in first, like I think quantity precedes quality, and then I think you can fill in the gaps. But what I often find, and with the more analysis I'm doing of shows and podcasts and content in general, is that guys will ramp up their quantity and then never slow down to actually really dial in the quality. And like,
mhm,
dude, like I'm number one with this too, right? Is that sometimes even a lot of things I say are they're versions of myself. I need to be able to slow down to relook at episodes, plan more in-person episodes, and there's just sometimes there needs to be that refinement. And that's how you make like those quantum leaps. You don't make
mm.
quantum leaps by just doing the same thing over and over again. It needs to slow down. Sometimes you need to kind of cross check where you're going to go from. And that's how we've been able to make the most amount of progress, I think. But overall, that's what a lot of guys are not willing to do, right? So they're willing to do the reps and then willing to
Mm.
slow down to see how we can make things better.
Yeah, I think then like perfect point of view there is like say you went from drinking, partying, that lifestyle, so you're on the I'm doing fuck all side of things a little bit more. I'm
Mm,
underperforming massively, and then you go scrap that, and then you likely maybe go so far the other way, and you're like oh shit, and then you pull yourself back to find yourself somewhere in the middle, much like training. Like when
mm,
if you go too far with training and you overtrain as per se or under recover, whatever we prefer to
mm,
use the term there, then you're likely going to pull it back too far the other way, and then you slightly bring it back, and it's just a constant, like the infinite game. Like you're constantly,
mm,
depending on other factors in your life, adjusting what is working best. And so I think that trying to find that perfect
mhm,
it may exist for a few weeks within your current routine, but then when one thing changes in your life, you're going to have to change again because that's no
mhm.
longer your manageable intake and output. Like you can't do that forever.
Agreed, man. Agreed.
So now, podcasting. You're
Go for
obviously
it.
very bullish on podcasting. If someone was to start a podcast today, what are some of the
Mhm.
key things you're giving advice wise to get them off the ground running well?
So the first thing you need to focus on is going to be your strategy, right? This is where 99% of people mess it up. They say, "Hey, I want to start a podcast," and they go off in a random direction. The first step is understanding who is a fur and the problem that you're solving. The reason why most podcasts don't grow is because they're not solving any problem, right? They start
Mm,
off and they're like, "I'm a relationship podcast," and they go on, they get some OnlyFans chicks and all this kind of stuff on their content. But then 6 months later, like, why is the episode not growing, and why is no audience coming back, and also why am I not making money? So I think the unique mechanism that we've been able to focus on is solving a specific problem. So let's just take the example of health, right? If you have a nutrition podcast and it's deep down the levels of different types of nutrition, you're coming on analyzing vegan diets, carnivore diets, whatever, right? As detailed as possible. Then you are someone who's helping a large volume of people with something that's a very big market, which is nutrition. From there, you're building this cult following because the people that are coming back are the people that are really interested in this vertical, and
mm,
you're positioning yourself as the authority. So I think there's this kind of platitude era whereby people are just putting out anything for engagement, whereas if you slow down on this and really focus on becoming the authority, giving out like really good valuable content that solves their specific problems, you build this very strong cult. We've worked with a lot of shows like this that could be in the finance space, there could be trading shows, and they're guys that cut through the noise of like generic trading content that's kind of like BS, and they're giving them very very specific details on like what's working for them and the lessons they have. These shows are absolutely blowing up. I mean, like 100,000, 200,000 views per episode, long form episode.
mm.
And the reason being is because that individual is an authority and has influence in there. And that's been the biggest thing for me, right? Is that, you mentioned like a bullish on podcasting. The reason being is because like when you go deep on one vertical, you become that niche. You become that word, you kind of own that word. So I think for me, that's been this primary focus is get podcasts to solve actual problems. And then if you're thinking, oh, well, I'm still early on in the day, I'm still trying to feel things out, you lean into your experiences. If you have a background
Mm,
in fitness and you're building this new app, you don't need to educate people on like this is it, like this is verbatim of how you do something, but you're also sharing your experiences. Sure, you're sharing your experiences as a founder who's building a tech platform, which is super complicated, it's super
mm.
difficult. There's a lot of challenges here, and most guys are not sharing their experiences. They're not sharing like what's happening in their life, the highs, lows, the challenges, the obstacles, because that's what people pull to, right? People buy the story, not the product. So
Yeah,
over time, if we're able to basically share a lot of that insight, you become that authority figure. And as time goes on, I think like it's going to be YouTube. It's going to be the focus, right? It's always going to be YouTube for content. I think going forward, YouTube is going to run over Apple and Spotify pretty soon. I said this in 2020, and people wanted to like do death threats on my door. Bear in mind, and 4 years later, it became true. Um, but basically, having that first focus, you become that main source of information. And the reason why I'm saying with YouTube and the problem solving is because let's use an example of when people start searching on Google and they say, how do I pick the perfect like keto diet? A lot of the content that's going to come up is going to be video. Google
yeah,
search now returns over 65, 70% video. And we want basically that to be the key search. And then from there, it's just about growing the machine, feeding the machine weekly. I would nearly advise weekly, if not bi weekly episodes, just to keep the machine going. I had a call with someone yesterday and they really wanted to grow their like personal development podcast. And there was a gap of like 4 months. And they're like, oh, we just had a small break. And I was thinking, I was like, that's the
Small.
problem. This guy's talking about like doing all these reels and stuff. And I'm like, dude, that's the problem, not this. So I think sometimes there needs to be that objective view to think like, okay, is this really what I want to do? And if you truly want to grow a podcast, you have to look, can you do it 100 times over? Because
Mm,
otherwise you're not going to stick with it, right? I can get on podcasts now and almost like naturally, organically pull out some of the ideas and share some of the insights for people and interview people with very little even preparation. Sometimes I can interview people. And I just think that because I've been kind of playing that longer term view, it's been easier for me to piece this together as time goes
yeah.
on because a lot of guys will get in and they'll quit 3 episodes in, 7 episodes in, 21 episodes in. But thankfully, I'd like to say a lot of our shows have got to the 20 episode mark that we've launched, and a lot of the other shows are doing much more higher numbers than that. But yeah, that would be my approach: 0 to 1 in the beginning and keeping it somewhat simple.
Mm. Do you think some people early doors are kind of too focused on what short content they get out of the podcast that they forget to actually have a good podcast?
That's a good question. Yeah, so that's definitely been engineered as like a bug of the system, I would say, that people are like
Mm.
focused too much on short form versus the actual long form itself. Now, at the same time, if that encourages more people to record podcasts, I would still encourage it, because like I know some of the biggest podcasters in the world are being coached on this stuff. Like they're being
Mm.
coached on asking shorter questions. They're being coached on getting shorter responses for short form and whatnot. So it's a feature, but I don't think it's definitely a negative of the industry. If anything, I think it's a positive, right? The more shorts that I see going viral of podcasts just cements podcasts more in society, right? They're just much more
Yeah.
of an embedded piece. The distribution mechanism is something that we're obviously heavily embedded in. That's how you get your voice out there. And I think podcasts are so difficult to grow as it is because the retention is so low. Unless your show is like really engaging, it's really clicked with
Yeah.
people. So if people want to use alternative mechanisms like shorts, LinkedIn posts, Instagram posts, even Snapchat, Twitter, newsletter, to bring that engagement back to the long form, I'm all for that. That's part of our flywheel. Like we have like a full flywheel of like 6 or 8 different verticals. So if we're running a show, we're hitting them on all of those different verticals. Because you kind
Mm.
of have to understand sometimes too, right? Is that, especially you have to hit people on different mediums depending on where they are in their journey. So let's say if you have your podcast, right? Not everyone can listen to 2 hours, but they might listen to a 10-minute clip. And then
Yeah.
people who don't want to listen to a 10-minute clip might actually watch shorts. If they don't want to watch the shorts, they might watch a newsletter, might read a newsletter. They also might read your LinkedIn post, might read a tweet, and you follow the whole way down. And
Yeah.
that's not even a funnel. That's just more of a top of marketing or top of awareness marketing funnel, which is basically just the top of it. It's just the top of it. And I
Yeah.
think that's at the very least how you're going to grow your podcast, right?
Yeah.
And that distribution mechanism is something that I've been just so focused on because it seems obvious and you see the big podcasters do it, but all the other ones don't do it. And that's a lack of systems and so on and so forth. So even like you mentioned there with people creating specifically for short form, I guarantee you that most of them don't even release the clips that they intended to because they don't have a
Yeah.
framework in place. Do you get me?
Yeah, like so they're prepping those questions specific to make sure that they drag out a short piece of content and then they don't follow through at the end of the day and actually get that up on the platforms.
Yeah, exactly. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the systems in place. And just had got off a very big call with a huge studio globally. And they said that like, nearly like 80-90% of their clients that come into the studio to record don't even get the episodes out because they get so caught up in their head because
Mm.
there is a lot of problems in the industry in terms of how difficult it is to edit and get episodes out and so on and so forth and basically manage that back end. It's just something that's super underestimated. I will put it that way. Like it's the most underestimated element of content is running a podcast because
Yeah.
there is so many different elements that can break. It's not just the editing, it's not just the design, it's not just a copy, it's about how it all formulates together. And even our review process, we could be sitting on a call looking at episodes thinking like, how does that title relate to the entry of the episode? How does that entry relate to the
Mm.
thumbnail? How does a thumbnail relate to the copy? So I just think that there's a bigger ecosystem play here. And this isn't for the best shows. This is just the reality of YouTube. I could show you some of the back end of some of the biggest YouTubers right now with some of these
Mm.
tools we have. And they change thumbnails every 20 minutes. They change titles every 2 hours. Um, YouTube game is wild, man, and it's only picking up. And like I'm looking at this, someone who runs a YouTube basically business, and I'm like,
Mm.
whoa, we got to step things up because the
Yeah.
way the pace is moving, it's moving very fast.
Well, it's interesting because, like, very openly, like, we've just now started only a couple of episodes ago, like, getting the medium clips and posting on YouTube as well. And, like, because what I'm noticing is, like, that those short form clips, like, it's especially early days, is the chances of virality, I guess, is kind of a little bit dependent on the guests that you had on as well, because we're
Mhm.
coming from a smaller platform to start with. But those medium clips, like you said on YouTube, it's the place to be. And not a lot of people go onto YouTube necessarily to sit there for 2 hours, but they're more than happy
Mm.
to sit there for 5 to 15 minutes because that's
100%.
kind of like the comfortable time frame. And so
Yeah.
like that's wholeheartedly. That's what we're starting to dive into a little bit more, is being like, let's play around and try and like think YouTube more.
Yep. And like this is a big thing that I'm focused on, right? Is how do we reverse engineer that? So let's say you're in the health space. Like a lot of people will want to figure out like how do I optimize my diet? How do I figure out like the best exercises for my chest or whatever? So those
Yeah.
if you were to ask a guest, let's say like what's the most optimal way to train in the gym? And he would give a rundown of like your rests, your sets, how much like gap should be between everything
Mm.
over the course of 14 minutes. And that becomes a very concrete piece of content that can be used as a medium clip, can also use as top of funnel clip, can get people into the ecosystem. And you may have heard me talk about the ecosystem play before. Like what I am effectively doing for a lot of our brands or for my own show is that it's not about like selling someone something. It's about bringing them into the ecosystem of what you do and basically providing value for them on multiple different spectrums. So we go back to the podcast, right? The podcast, long form, so much free value of 230 episodes. Then we have short form. I have like 700 videos on YouTube of short form. Then we have the long form newsletter once a week, 7 LinkedIn posts a week, 7 IG reels a week, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of free stuff there. Okay. And then when they're in that ecosystem, they can learn, build businesses. I have a bunch of young people that have built huge businesses, given up alcohol, done a bunch of stuff as a result from the content. But if people want to move on, they can go check out some of our programs. They can join our coaching program. They can actually grow a podcast or build a podcast and have it done by you. So I think allowing that natural ascension leads to such a better ecosystem because everyone then is part of it. And people
Mm.
can come and detach and learn and move on and recommend people and so on and so forth. And like half of our business in the past like 2 years, not half, I'd say a quarter, have been people being like, I've loved the journey of kickoff sessions. I've been involved in Voix, even though I don't have a podcast. I have a bunch of mates here who actually want to grow their podcast or whatnot. Here's like some intros. And I don't even encourage it, but it's just a fact that you give someone so much
Yeah.
free value that they actually want to be involved. Like a lot of people genuinely want to be involved with the journey because you're there for them as well, right? I think
Mm.
not a lot of people are serving their audience, right? They're not really specifically there to serve their audience. And yeah, you can run offers, yeah, you can build stuff on the back end of it. But if you're not solving problems on the front end, like why are we here? And
Yeah.
that's a really big focus for me because we have a business, right? I have CEO of a business. I'm running this. I don't need to be putting out loads of videos all the time unless they're really valuable. So that's why these conversations like today, they're very much granular in terms of practical, actionable steps for people.
Yeah. And it's interesting, I guess, with the YouTube side of things, then also you added the level, like how many times if you search up that optimal training, you're maybe go back in time or watch a video that's from 7 years ago. So like
Yeah.
no one's going back and watching a 7 year ago TikTok like or Instagram
Yeah.
video. Like that's very rare unless someone has like reposted it. Whereas YouTube, like you're there in the game for a lot longer as well.
100%, bro.
Yeah.
Like that's the beauty of YouTube. It's a gift that keeps on giving, right?
Mm.
So the videos you have that pop off in 2020 are going to come back around in 2024. Like I've ever gone to the back end of some of our analytics, even for some of our clients, some of their old stuff will just pop, and right place, right time.
Mm.
Discovery is better. YouTube changed our algorithm around search and keywords and whatnot, and yeah, it just works. So I think focusing much more on YouTube is really helpful for people, having that center focal point, really putting your best effort in. And I mean, like hitting your criteria of releases, like not being sloppy, not being lazy, holding a good standard for what you can do. Even for a lot of the content you're repurposing, like people can tell if it's AI or not generated. Like a lot of those clips and stuff, they look fucking god awful.
Mm.
So it's all, I would nearly say like you'd forego that. Bring in a freelance editor who can help you with short form, who gets your ideas, get your vision, get what you want to do, has a bit of a unique spin and mechanism on it. And then from there, where I'm really focused on is the revenue, right? Is the business side of things. Is like, how do we connect this to an offer? So whether you are a coach, a fitness coach, you have a nutrition podcast, and then you also have a nutrition app or whatnot, right? Like the having that ascension, I think is is most of the battle won and lost. Because I remember hearing years ago, years ago, that you can't make money from a podcast. And I remember I was super early on in my journey. I think I was like 40 episodes in. I interviewed a guy who was a industry like expert in podcasting, and I was like, that's weird. That's super weird thing to say. And then I learned that the problem isn't the podcast, the problem is the entrepreneur and the
Mm.
offer. So I spend a lot of my times these days like turning around businesses on the back end because I would look at something and they'd say, we're running content, we're doing this, but the alignment is off. So like if you sell a nutrition app, but your content is even focused on training, right? It's
Mm.
like, yes, it's similar, but there's a misalignment. And you may have seen that like example of if it's a ship that's slightly off course by like 10 degrees, it ends up like 600 miles or something ridiculous. And that's kind of the way I think about offers sometimes, is that alignment has to be super dialed in. And we've struggled with that sometimes, right? With some of our clients, we've had to change them and move them around and make sure they're aligned. That can process can take 2 weeks, 6 months. It depends on how how screwed up it is. But I think that's how you're going to scale a lot of the back end. And look, we've been able to do it across multiple different shows and even our own shows. So it's not that it's not possible. It's just the fact that you just have to be very dialed in.
Yeah. Do you think then, from a monetization point of view, too many people are just focused on what brand deal can I get rather than how can I funnel the podcast into a business?
Yeah, so that's what's interesting, right? Is we're doing like 500K a quarter in sponsorships, right? But honestly, like I wouldn't recommend anyone to start with sponsorships because there's
Mhm.
such a big threshold you need to hit to get there, right? And the reason why we've worked with so many different brands is because they kind of want to work with a company that's going to handle the sponsorships versus some like bro creator from like Miami, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so emotional. So my kind of first principles approach on this is forget sponsorships. When they start coming inbound, that's when you can almost start running outbound. So like you're at a stage whereby you've like 5,000 downloads an episode or 3,000 downloads. It's really, really growing. The YouTube is growing to like 10 or 20,000 views per video. And then you're batting the inbound opportunity. But before that, I would look at building an actual offer on the back end because let's say if you're a coach, you can coach people. If you're a writer, you can ghostwrite for people. If you're in sales, you can help people with their sales, right? So it's way more predictable, way easier to get lead flow, and way easier to build a successful business if that's dialed in. Sponsorships, cherry on top. It'll happen downstream. Um, and I think we've been lucky and fortunate in that regard too, is that just picking the right podcasts to get sponsored, right? When we're working with big brands, making sure that we can really get an ROI, because the irony is that if you can't get a good return on investment for a brand, you're just going to torch the relationship overall.
Mm. I imagine a big part of that also comes from, actually, if let's say it's your podcast that you're getting a brand deal on, it's like not being a sellout and having a genuine connection or genuine feeling towards that product or service as well. Like how many times
Yep.
you see an influencer and they can't stop posting about some fucking sauna blanket, and then they got something for their toes and something for their butthole, and you're like, dude, you don't use these things. You just wanted the 15K for the post. Like, piss off,
Mm.
because you're also now burning your audience. And it's like, so just see it and just wait, because the right connection will come for you, because that's kind of what you're putting out to the world. So that's what those brands will see you as well.
100%, man. And like, this is where you want to detach almost the outcome from the input, right? Is like, you don't want to just take something that comes at you. You want to make sure that there's a right alignment, especially if you're using the product, for fuck's sake. We see a
Mm,
lot of times brands will want to sponsor a show and then we'd have to turn it down because we're like, okay, they actually don't use it. It could be, let's say, a platform or a product or a service. So we need to make sure that we don't even do it. Even this morning, we actually killed a sponsorship with a very, very big tech company because of the fact that they were getting negative feedback from people, just saying
mm,
they didn't like the company and so on and so forth. And we're like, okay, whatever, just crush it, move on, crush it, move on. So sometimes you need to look at that things objectively, but that's always going to be the case, right? But as brands get smarter, so like back in the day for 2015, 2020, Instagram was much more to do with followers, like how much followers you have. Whereas now it's much more engagement driven. So it's like, who is your cult? Where your cult situated? Like, how did he actually engage with you? What's the click rate? What's click through rate look like? Like, how does this piece together into much more of a holistic piece? And we were very early on that. I would say 2021, 2022, we were approaching brands in a different way than most people. We were giving them like a holistic view of like all of their brand and who they would actually come in and work with. And people really like that. We were very early on with that, and that's why we kind of crushed it in that space. But again, markets adjust, people catch up, and so on and so forth.
mm. So what are some things that you would like, if someone is then they're trying to figure out when they should know. So partly you said if people start to reach out, but like when do you kind of know? You've just said there it's not necessarily followers, but what are some of the targets on those click-through rates? What are some of the targets on how many, listens you're getting on an episode before you start to go,
Mm,
hey, I'm picking up a little something here. Maybe I could
yep.
start to leverage this.
So I would actually reframe it and have it as how like niche your show is initially. So
Hmm.
one of the things I focus on is like the main criteria that a sponsor will want to look at. So if yours is super super niche, like you're very very dialed in your niche, it actually doesn't matter about how big you are. It matters about how deep you are. So
Yeah.
that's an interesting inflection point, right? Because most people are like business, and it's just you're competing with all the big boys, all the big shows, and it's just all over the place. So if you can go super super detailed, you could be very small. Like, man, we have shows that are doing 500 downloads a month, and they've done 250,000 a year in sponsorships because
Well.
they own the audience, and they
Mm.
also have a very tight hold on, like, let's say a specific brand or niche or so on and so forth. So they own that niche. So if you're in a bit of a broader niche, I would say on downloads between 3,000 to 5,000 an episode, and on views around 10,000 plus an episode, gives you like good leverage, because it's always about leverage, right? Someone holds the
Mm.
power in these conversations. So if your show is not niche, you're going to need to really play the reach card. Um, and that works. But the problem is the click through rate's going to be low. And we've
Yeah.
seen that over and over again, is that people are not actually engaged with the content. They do not want to actually work with the brand. So you need to spin it for sure. And then get a bit more involved with actually the brand, what they want to achieve, and so on and so forth, and move towards their goals. Because, bro, if you can sell someone on what they want to achieve, like where do they want to be versus what you want, you can do whatever you want, bro.
Mm.
You can sign any particular deal if you're really really in tune with what they want to achieve, which is getting more customers and decreasing how much it costs for them, bro. Anything is possible, But most people don't think like that. They don't think in
It's
terms
about,
of how they can help the brand.
yeah, about making the listener the hero rather than yourself.
Yeah, and the brand.
Yeah. Like the brand that you're working with in the context of that as well. Like not your own
Yeah,
brand necessarily, but like whoever you're putting forward there.
exactly, man. Because like most people think about themselves, right? Same with sales, they think about themselves, think about their business, and so on. But if you can tap into like what the other person individually wants, so for these companies, they want to get more customers. Put it very simple: they want to increase their revenue, increase their customers. Are you the person that can do that? If you can, it makes sense. If you're not, someone else can, and you protect your brand much more by not signing as random bullshit, basically.
Hmm.
So we have a lot of quality control over that, just to make sure that the right people are being seen and we're getting the right shows on the right platform.
Mm. Now, on a more personal note, you said, really early on in the episode here, 100-hour weeks is something that you're putting out within your business and things like that. And you've talked about that time to value ratio and how important that
Mm.
is. How do you operate with that?
Yeah, man, that's everything. That's literally like the most important like lesson that you can get as an entrepreneur, is like, how fast can you give someone value when they give you their credit card? And the only answer is instantaneously. It's the
Hmm.
only way. There's no other answer. There's not 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. And I was my own critic of this. When we launched our new coaching program, there was a lot of like mechanics in the back end that had to be built. But it was important. Like there was a timeline deliberate. And even in myself, I was like, we didn't do it instantly, which is something that I wanted to fill in and fix, which is what we're doing going forward. But I think that's the most important lesson, is when you're building something and you have a vision for something and someone is investing in you as a result to work with you or buy your product or buy your service, they need to be feel like they're heard and seen and moving forward. So being able to connect with someone and give them a ton of value in the beginning, like even we're doing this conversation today, is so important. It's the most important thing. So the way I think about this in the context of our business is, if someone wants to work with us, we will immediately like onboard them, send them a ton of like learning information, get them embedded into our coaching program, get them embedded into a lot of the systems and processes. So they're almost overwhelmed to some degree. They can take their time going through it, of course, but it's almost like
Mm.
they what you want to prove to people that they've made such a good decision that they want to come back over and over again. Because that's what it is, right? If you're a fitness guy, if you're a podcast guy, content guy, you need to be about it. And I think for us, I've been trying to eliminate that time to value ratio to zero, like the literal zero. And as we're building a better business, build a better program, better service, better offer, I'm just always looking at those different verticals to see how we can really
Yeah.
interject with people immediately. But it's important, man, because think of how many things have you worked with that don't offer that. That you're in
Yeah.
the dark, you're putting your hand up, you're looking around you, and you don't want people chasing you, right? The second a customer, client, members chasing you is the second they're going out the back door, basically.
Yeah, and I guess if you've boosted that expectation massively with the high quality of free content, then that expectation is, well, shit, imagine if that's free, imagine what the paid one is. And then if you're met with something that takes 3 days to get in your inbox, you're like, well, that's a bit shit.
Yeah. And I think what's important there is like if it is going from free to paid, the difference there is personalization. So and that's where you need to be able to achieve it like at different levels. Obviously, price comes into play here too. But if someone is looking for something very, very specific and the price is really high or it's like relative to like a service offering, then the difference you're offering is personalization. You're going deep into what their problems are, their pains are. You're actually solving it for them. You're solving it there for them. You're either helping them or you're working with them. And I don't think that's people are looking for the more turnkey solution, the entrepreneur. Whereas
Mm.
there's beauty in the detail. There's beauty actually being really stuck in with the client or the customer and looking at their personal situation and seeing how you can make those adjustments. That's what people are looking for. They want to be seen. They want to be heard. You can get ahead of 99% of people by just showing up on time, being kind, being personal to where their situation is, and really focus on solving their problems. And I think when we launched our new offer, 90% of it was around problem solving. That was
Yeah.
literally it. It was as simple as tell me your biggest problems, we'll build a solution. And that's how a lot of businesses should be built. Most of them aren't, which
Mm.
gave us a lot of leverage, right? Because we're able to solve the problems. We've been through this a lot. We've released like 700 episodes. So I think I'm seeing the same cracks over and over again. But I almost want it to be said by the person to be able to go in and solve it for them then. Instead of me
Mm.
hypothesizing saying, oh, like your podcast needs to be done this way. It's like if it comes from the individual and we figure out their problem, then we can go solve better problems basically.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I wonder in the modern world, and we can spiral down this as well. Like with how much loneliness in the world is becoming an issue. If you're
Mhm.
giving them that feeling of being like, oh my god, they really care. Like this is really about me. They understand me. Like you have solved a much deeper problem than you ever realized. Even podcasting. Maybe you're helping someone to grow their podcast by being that person that gets back to them so quickly. You may not realize the other problems you're actually solving in their life, and loneliness being one of those things. They go, oh my goodness,
100%.
this person cares when I don't feel like anyone else in my life cares, and I work from home and I've got no one around me.
Mm,
It's like they're fucking in now. Like it's solved many
mm.
problems.
Yeah, man, and like that was only said to me last night. Would you believe? Funny you mentioned that from one of our coaches, which was, there's also the emotional side of all of this, which is like, yes, it's tactical, yes, there's frameworks and there's tools, but people also just want to connect with people and they want to be able to like be seen
Yeah.
and be heard and to build a brand and to build like a network of people and to interact with other people. And I think that's something that is massively overlooked is the fact that, and it's overlooked by me as well, who's like much more like the logical brain versus emotional, which is
Mm.
yes, we can do all the bells and the whistles, but fundamentally, like you're coming for podcasting because you want to build a better network. You want to solve a lot of your problems on a personal basis. Because, dude, like if people didn't want to speak, they could just Google the answers.
Yeah.
They could just find the answers on Google. So there's a different reason why people come, and that's the reason why they stay. Even the consumers, the guys that don't even have the podcast, the guys that are listening, they're coming and learning a complete different vertical,
Yeah.
in a different way, which opens up a new opportunity. So that's what I'm really kind of dialed in on now is seeing like how can we optimize that performance in terms of when people want to actually really grow, how can you really connect with them, solve their problems? It's just basic problem solving, right? Which I guess goes over a lot of people's heads instead of just shoving a solution on someone that they don't even need sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in understanding the concept that like loneliness is not necessarily a lack of people, it's the lack of connection. So if you create that connection
Mm,
with the person, like it's they see people on the internet all the time, they're scrolling, they walk past people all the time at the shops and things like that, but they're not
mm,
connected to people. So if you can opt in and give them that connection and that feeling that you're really there with them as well, then you're massively solved that problem. And they
mm.
will continue to see you more as an authority as well.
Yeah, man. 100%. That's really interesting, bro. Have you noticed that yourself too with your own podcast in terms of like connecting with other people that A lot of these guys are like lost. They don't have much
Yeah.
direction in friend group.
Well, I find interesting, like say, like I don't know whether this is exactly the path you were sort of taking with this, but I've had a few people that do listen to the pod, come up to me and be like, "Oh, like I really enjoy when the guests or yourself go a little bit more personal," and it's not like so
Mm,
because I was coming at it with such the same. Entrepreneurs are logically minded, like we're not necessarily thinking about that emotional. And I always say to my advisor, I'm like, I'm good at product, I'm not that good at marketing because I'm more logical, and I'm like, well, the product should be enough. But the same thing here. And so I was coming into a podcast episode thinking, all right, let's like say I have someone like yourself on. It's like, oh, well, we're just going to talk about podcasting. That's the value I want to give. But I'm like, no, but because people want that connection. And so hence why, like, we started the episode, we were talking just about mindset, living in Bali, all these sort of things. That's what really connects people to understand that's a human being on the other side. And now I really do connect with what they're saying and the topics that they're talking about as well, which I thought was quite interesting because I had to step back, swallow my own thoughts about what I should make my podcast, and that has allowed me to level up a little bit more as well.
100%, because like I would say it's almost 50-50. I call it educational entertainment, right? The
Mm,
education is much more like tactical, strategic, like, here's what you're going to learn, XYZ. The entertainment is much more based on a story and the
yeah.
connection and the emotional connection. And even for myself, I've struggled with that for sure. Being able to pull out those different verticals, those stories. I've been much more open with it recently because I'm like, fuck it, like happy to share these stories now. But when I was younger, a bit more like insecure, like didn't really want to kind of share those opinions online, I was much more closed off.
Yeah.
But now I'm kind of at the point whereby, 230 episodes in, I'm like, oh fuck it, I don't care. Like, and it also is going to help other people. And my journey has been crazy like that, because it's been ups and downs and everything's been documented, right? For like
Mhm.
almost 5 years. Like you can almost see my hair grow at the rate we've been recording, right? It's just been
Yeah.
constant over and over again. So that's the beauty of podcasting, right? That's the beauty of this type of content. This is why I'd always favor long form over even written
Mm.
over even like obviously short form, because when you're writing, especially for Twitter or LinkedIn, it's going to be to the point. There's going to be the hook and everything. Whereas here, we're just chilling, like happy to answer any
Yeah.
questions, go in any direction, and that's the reality of most conversations. They're fluid.
Yeah, and I'd even a layer again there. Like, obviously, we're in different countries, so we're doing it virtually, but in person just adds a whole nother layer. Like I said to you at the start before, I've done 3 trips interstate in the last, few months as well, because there's value in that. Even if it's that 10-minute conversation we have before, or just, catching body language and how you can lead the conversation and understand maybe what that person's more interested in, it's so much better.
Mhm.
So, like, I think if you can just go that extra mile, that 1% more where possible as well.
100%, man. Completely agree.
Yeah, and I think it's good though that you're like, like you said, like the willingness to be open a little bit more online as well is like as much as you may, you probably do get some of the messages with the guys you're helping with the alcohol as well, is that we
Mhm.
don't necessarily understand that the people that don't say anything about how it's helped them, like it makes a huge impact because, that's kind of like why part of the reason why I started the podcast, interestingly, like we're talking about niches and stuff. And I'm probably that guy that's a little bit too general, but not necessarily trying to monetize as per se. And I was like, I just want to have the conversations that probably other 20 or 20s sort of period people want to have. The
Yeah.
curiosity, the I'm fucking lost, trust me, I still am, and those sort of things. And so people hear that and they're like, oh, that's okay. Like, I don't want to
Mm.
come across as this guy that's got it all figured out because trust me, nowhere near.
100%, and exact same as me, right? And I think people look at external events and think that that's a reflection of internal. And we kind of touched on this in the beginning, but it's not, right? It's completely not. Like I spoke to Robert Glover this morning about like marriage advice. We married pretty soon, and I was like, "How the
Mm,
fuck do I do that?" And he was like, "Well," he was like, "I've been divorced 3 times, so here we go." And I was like, "All right, let's fucking go," because just because you're a master, quote unquote, in one domain means you're still a novice in many other ones.
mm,
And we look at people like Justin Welsh, Sahil Bloom, like a lot of these big guys that have smashed it. But a lot of them have gone through tough changes too in their life, right?
yeah,
Justin was in these big tech companies. He had a what did he have? He had like a panic attack. He left all the work. Sahil Bloom was living West Coast, private equity. He gave up everything and moved back East Coast with his family. So like these handbrake turns happen. And what we see, obviously, it's a super cliche, but we obviously just see the final rep and we see what people
Yeah.
look like on the outside and polished. But the reality is much different, right? Under the surface, dealing with like the anxiety, the stress,
Yeah.
the coping mechanisms, and what I've learned as well. So, like, surface level, my kind of approach is much more like, driven, get shit done type of personality. But a lot of that under the surface comes from like a shit ton of like trauma and like fucking insecurity and avoidance and detachment and stuff. So it's easier to build a business than it is to go solve your fucking internal problems. Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of one reason how I've ended up in a position that I've ended up in relatively young. Whereas all the other stuff I'm still filling in the gaps on, dude,
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
fucking therapy
100%.
every single week to trying to figure out what's going on in my brain, right? And like, you know, I think that like for most people that'd be, oh, it's fine, you just figure it out. Whereas like for me, it's an ongoing thing.
Yeah. And that's all the strengths and weaknesses that we have and the different elements that we're better at. Like someone that goes, oh, relationships are easy. It's like, yeah, but you make no fucking money. Or like, and you maybe can't support your
Yeah.
family. It's like, sure, your marriage is easy, but it's like, there's that other layer. And I'm not saying one is better than
Mm.
the other. Or like you're crushing it in business, you're crushing it at home, but you're a fat piece of shit. And it's like, well, there's another layer that we're not crushing. Or, how many guys in the gym are fucking jacked, shredded, they're tan, they spend all this time at the beach, and they've been single their whole life. They eat out of fucking glass containers for every meal of the day. No one wants to be with them because they're borderline psychotic. And you're like, well, where's the line here? Like that you can't have
Yeah.
everything straight away.
100%, bro. It's so funny, right? It's like I do think like in your 20, well, I think in your early teens you should max the fuck out of the health vertical.
Mm,
And then in your 20s, you should max the fuck out of the wealth vertical. And then the faster you solve the wealth problem, and then you move on to the relationship problem. That's been kind of my kind of journey, right? Is that I was
yeah.
just always in decent shape. I was always focused on the gym. And like the years I spent in my early teens training all the up to now has kind of allowed me to kind of always stay in really good shape. And like I'm much more aggressive with my diet right now, but like I'm just always in that 80% out of 100
Yeah.
level, let's say, of like fitness. And then it allowed me to transition more into focusing on the business, having the health dialed in, walking when I need to, eating well, going to the gym, reducing my stress, going to the sauna, reducing like inflammation, whatever. And then the next kind of phase, I guess, has been kind of piecing in the relationship,
Yeah.
and working more on that, right? So the way it was explained to me, and I will never credit something that I didn't do myself, is my fiance said to me, she was like, "You have a business coach, you have a sales coach, you have a health coach, you have a nutrition coach, and a training coach, and even an endurance coach, but you don't have a mental health coach."
Yeah.
And I was like, that's interesting. So I had like basically avoided the thing that I was actually needing to solve and focus much more on that. So that then basically all the other verticals improve. And then the way she pitched it to me was like, and she absolutely pitched it was like, the more you focus on that, the bigger the business will grow, the
Yeah.
more relaxed you'll be, the better sleep you're gonna have, the better relationships you're gonna have, and so on. So I was like, yeah, like this is super fucking important. Um,
Yeah.
and again, you have to pay with your credit card, right? Because if I didn't pay with my card, I wouldn't be committed to getting better with it. And
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in that. Big believer in that. That you need to make the investment, whether it's time investment or money investment, to actually go make a change.
Yeah, and I think breaking that stigma as well with the mental side of things. It's not it's kind of being proactive, not reactive with those things as well. But you're not even just doing it because you're like, I'm depressed or I'm this or I'm that. It doesn't, like, that's not necessarily what those people are also there for. Like, there's a reason that like the highest performers in sport have sports psychologists. Now those
Hundred
sports
percent.
psychologists are not necessarily just there to get them out of the time where they're like feeling really anxious, or maybe they're having a bout of quote unquote depression because they had 5 bad games in a row, whatever it is. That's not necessarily the terminology. It's how do we optimally get you to perform mentally, and therefore it'll help you perform optimally physically. And so
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
changing that stigma, like it's same as you, I've been and I've talked to a psychologist. It's not because I wanted to drive into a tree. It's because I feel like my brain can do more. And I'm, I hope there's people, anyone that is feeling that way, like, please could also get the help, because, no one should feel that way, but it doesn't
Mhm.
have to be for that sole reason that you're in a corner crying.
Yeah, and like you don't need to hit rock bottom to solve the problem, right? And this is
No.
why, when I cut alcohol, like probably like a bunch of people were like, "Oh, he obviously had a problem with alcohol." I didn't. I didn't have a problem with alcohol. I was partying. I went to Ibiza a few times, but I wasn't.
Yeah.
I had a problem. I just wanted to. I was like, let's say I was drinking like, I'm trying to give an example. Like, let's say it was like 20 or 30% of my week going out partying. Where just like if I got rid of that, I can put that time into something else. So it was the same with this, right? Even though I was going through, I guess, like a lot of like negative thought patterns or just like the business wearing you down and all this kind of stuff for a few weeks. And I remember went through like 1 or 2 months where I was like, ooh, like, I feel like my personal experiences are coming out. Like your business is a reflection of you often, right? And like if
Mm.
I was more stressed, like it just felt like things were more stressed in the business. And even now, after going back to therapy, I feel like that things are just much more stable. And if things pop up, it's chill. And what I like to say, which I don't, necessarily like to happen, but like a lot of the earlier experiences you have in life, like strengthen where you are right now. So the way I kind of frame it is like, if I had all this when I was a kid and went through a bunch of tough shit as a child, then the stuff I'm working on now is fine.
Yeah.
I can figure it out. It's nothing in comparison, right? So it's like that happened. It sucked. We're
Yeah.
working on it, but we're getting better as a result from it. Versus the that happened. Oh my god, I'm a victim. My life is miserable, and so on and so forth. So it's hard to tell someone who's going through a difficult time to just like reframe it. But I think the more active work you do on it allows you to be able to internalize it, vocalize it, not just internalize it, vocalize it, come to a bit of a kind of decision on it and then get better from it. And I remember, dude,
Mm.
like the weeks leading up to going back to therapy, I was like just off, like I wasn't like reading, I wasn't really walking as much. I was coming out of dengue, I was kind of sick, and I had like I tore my hamstring, just like a bunch of shit was going on. And I just kind of like was in a bit of a lull. And then I noticed I was like, we're like closing less, business wasn't growing as much, and things were kind of slowing down a small bit. And then I kind of went back, and I remember the next day I woke up and I was like, "Ooh." I just woke
Mm.
up next morning. I felt like I had a wave of energy back, and I got back to walking in the morning. I read in the morning, just getting back on it basically, and like much more in alignment. Whereas previously I was much more like avoidance, right? It's like I have this problem over here, but if I bang my head off my laptop for 12 hours a day, it doesn't fester. But like it does fester, right? And there's like a fantastic like Nietzsche quote on this. I'm fucking gonna butcher it, but basically it's just like there's nowhere else to hide but yourself, effectively. Like at some point you can't hide from
Yeah.
yourself. I don't know who the quote is basically, but that was one of the biggest things for me. That was like, all right, I need to sort this out. Because
Yeah.
like the the extreme example is that like people fucking build this up and then go in and shoot up a school, right? Like that's the extreme example of this stuff. Is
Mm.
like if you don't solve it, it just compounds. We go back to the positive and negative habits, bro. Right. And this is
Yeah.
why I
Yeah.
always have to like vocalize where I'm at, because like I'm not telling someone to fucking be consistent with their content, and then if I'm a mess, it's like I recognize this as like I recognize a negative thought pattern is a bad habit, and it's only going to get worse if I don't
Mm.
fix it.
Mm. Mm.
So if I actually interject and fix it, my life will just become a million times better, and I can just be a
Yeah.
fucking regular human again. So yeah, man. And then like you do it for everything else. You do it for your relationship. You do it for your health. You do it for your wealth. You do it for all the other stuff. But I don't even know how much I spend, dude. I spend probably like $500 a month. I don't give a shit about it. It's just gone. Whatever. It's going to be helpful
Mm.
for me. I'm going to do it as long as I need to. Um, just like a coach, right? I've had a coach for like 2 years, training coach,
Yeah.
and I've never in my entire life thought about getting rid of him. Not once.
Yeah.
Not once.
Well, it's like I,
'Cause I
I,
don't need
I
to.
only I like about a month or so ago started like jujitsu. I'm not gonna fucking try and teach myself how to do jujitsu, rolling with myself on the floor in my home, like wrestling my dog. Like that's probably not gonna teach me how to like become a black belt. But
Yeah.
and at the same time, I haven't studied the brain, like so I don't know how to solve some of those problems. But at the same
Mm.
time, what I find quite interesting is that when you go to talk to someone and you kind of just like brain dump on these people in a way, I guess some form of framework that they've put together, is you actually start to solve the problems half the time yourself. You actually have those,
100%.
oh shit, oh. But when you're in your own head, same with creativity, trying to grind out solving these, you can't. You got to get out of your head,
100%.
and then that's where the growth and the change comes from.
Yeah, man, 100%. I think that's the beauty of therapy, is that it's a non-biased opinion of your scenario.
Yeah,
So, like, you could be like XYZ, and then the woman would just be like, "Oh, like, how does that make you feel?" And then, because usually your friend or your spouse or whatever would interject with their biased opinion of you, this woman is actually, or a guy is letting you like elaborate more, which allows you to solve your own problems for yourself up front.
yeah,
Um, and that was the biggest thing for me, right? Like, I was in therapy in 2021, 2022, and I took a break for like a year or two, and then I came back to it. And yeah, like, I'm excited for it. Like, I actually like it, as in, I think it's a great way to just understand like the brain more. And even, I remember like the woman individual was like, "Oh, like, what do you want to get out of it?" And I was like, "That's a weird question to ask someone." But I was like, "Oh, like, I guess if we're looking for fucking goals, then like, here's the goal I want
mm,
to achieve, or like, here's what I want to understand, or like, here's where I want to piece together," right? Because I don't know, like, I think from the podcast itself, I've become very introspective, because I'm like always I'm meeting millionaires, dude, like twice a week,
yeah,
right? So like, it leads me to wanting to be better, and it leads me to looking at where I currently am, right? Like, literally like twice a week for like 4 years.
yeah,
So as a result of that, it changes your behavior pattern, right? And then that's why I'm much more easy to now be on the other receiving side, where I'm the speaker and I'm speaking to a therapist who understands what's going on
yeah.
beyond the curtain.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I never would have even thought of like going to a therapist and setting goals, I guess, as per se. It's kind of like you're like, I
Mm.
set goals in the gym, I set goals with business. You're like, I don't set goals with my brain. What are you talking about? Like, that's an interesting, but it makes perfect
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. It's like, what do you want to figure out, right? Like, what do you want to achieve? And I was like, that's an interesting observation. But it's cool, man. Like, I recommend everyone doing it. There's a lot of free resources online.
Mm,
There's a lot of cheaper resources online. I know platforms like BetterHelp and stuff can get you started for like $60 roughly per session,
mm.
maybe a little bit less. Um, but it's just worth it. It's definitely worth to just uncover what's going on, and then you can go off and fucking journal and do this shit and do that stuff. But go from the right foundations, like we discussed earlier in the
Yeah.
very beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like, I think too many people will jump to a book or a podcast sometimes as well. And not obviously, it's kind of what we're both doing, but like that's not going to solve your problems. You need that deeper, much like reading a book on how to build muscle won't build muscle. Reading a book on how to optimize your brain likely won't optimize your brain.
Theory versus practice.
Exactly, exactly. All right, well, we might wrap things up there, Darren. I really appreciate your time. There's so much value in that for people especially for guys in their 20s, 30s, whatever it is, where they're a little bit lost as well, but also massively in people getting started in podcasting. So I really appreciate your time.
Appreciate it, sir, and happy to do many more in the future, man.